The first time I heard my own voice replayed, slowed down by an investigator's software, it sounded like a hand resting on someone's shoulder. Calm, steady, kind. That was the word everyone used, kind. I was sitting alone in my apartment, blinds half closed, a legal pad on the table that I hadn't written on in weeks. The audio crackled, then my voice came through the speakers again, softer than I remembered. I heard myself say everything would be fine. What startled me wasn't the lie. It was how much I still believed it while listening. Even then, even knowing what followed. There's a particular tone that makes people lean forward without realizing it. It isn't confidence, it's something gentler. A suggestion that panic is unnecessary, that urgency is for other people, that there's time. Time was always the word that landed. I could hear the pause in my speech, the moment where I let silence do the work. I remembered how the man on the other end of the line had exhaled, how his voice dropped half an octave when he answered, how relief arrived before permission. When the recording ended, the room felt smaller. I sat there longer than I needed to, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, waiting for the sense of control to return. It didn't. That was the first moment I understood what my voice had become to them, and what it had cost. I didn't start out thinking of myself as someone who took things from people. That came later after repetition smoothed the edges of the idea. At the beginning, I was just a voice on the phone. Not a cold call. Never that. The calls were always expected, scheduled days in advance. I'd introduce myself carefully, using my full name, my title, the company line that sounded institutional enough to relax the shoulders. Most of them were already tired by the time we spoke. Years of working, of planning, of being told the future was a fragile thing that needed constant monitoring. Retirement does that to people. It doesn't feel like rest. It feels like a cliff with brochures. I learned quickly that numbers weren't what made them listen. Numbers came later. What mattered was rhythm, the pace of my breathing, the way I mirrored their hesitations. If they spoke slowly, I slowed. If they rushed, I steadied. I never interrupted fear. I let it talk itself out. They told me about spouses who worried too much, about children who didn't understand money but had opinions anyway, about the feeling that something important could slip through their fingers if they looked away for even a moment. I agreed without agreeing. I understood without validating anything specific. I spoke in generalities that felt personal. By the end of the first call, most of them thanked me. That always surprised me, even after it stopped surprising me. Gratitude arrived early, before anything had happened. That was when trust formed. Not because I asked for it, because I never seemed to need it. I positioned myself as someone who wasn't in a hurry, someone who could afford patience. The contrast did the work. The world was loud. I was quiet. I told them I would call back in a week. Sometimes two. I let anticipation settle like dust. By the time we spoke again, my voice felt familiar to them, like a radio station they'd been leaving on in the background. That was enough. There's a moment somewhere between reassurance and decision where people begin to hand responsibility away. Not fully. Just enough to rest. I recognized that moment by the way their questions changed. Less what if and more when. Less challenge, more confirmation. I never told anyone what to do. I framed options like observations. I talked about flexibility, about control, about not being locked into systems that no longer served them. Their pensions became characters in a story we were telling together. Heavy, old-fashioned, rigid. I never criticized them directly. I let the implication do the work. Every call added a little pressure, not by increasing urgency, but by reducing alternatives. Other paths began to feel cluttered, complicated, emotionally noisy. My path felt clean. Sometimes there were hesitations, a pause too long, a question asked twice. When that happened, I softened. I reminded them of earlier conversations. I reflected their own words back to them, altered just enough to sound wiser. I spoke about dignity, about independence, about not wanting to be a burden later. Those phrases landed harder than any statistic ever could. I felt the shift when they stopped taking notes, when they leaned back, when they laughed, briefly, as if embarrassed by how anxious they'd been before. Once a man asked me if I was sure. I told him certainty was overrated. That clarity mattered more. That answer pleased him. I could hear it. By the third or fourth call, the decision began to feel like something they had already made. I simply walked alongside it. I started to notice something else then, a tightening in my own chest after the calls ended. Not guilt, not yet. Something closer to anticipation. A sense of momentum that didn't belong to either of us individually anymore. The process had its own gravity. When paperwork entered the conversation, I treated it like a formality, a bridge already halfway crossed. I guided without pushing. I explained without insisting. They signed because it felt inevitable. Because inevitability had been building quietly for weeks. When the funds moved, I congratulated them, not enthusiastically, calmly, like a doctor confirming a stable result. Most of them slept better that night. I know because they told me later. That knowledge stayed with me longer than the money did. The unraveling didn't arrive all at once. It never does. It came in fragments, a voicemail here, an email forwarded accidentally, a tone that had shifted from relaxed to tight. I told myself it was external. Markets move, circumstances change. People reinterpret decisions when outcomes become visible. Still, I listened more closely after that, to my own voice, to the pauses I'd once used so effectively. One afternoon, I received a call I hadn't scheduled. I recognized the number immediately. I let it ring longer than usual before answering. His voice sounded thinner, not angry, confused. He asked a question we'd already covered. Then he asked it again, differently. I responded the same way I always had, calm, steady, kind. Halfway through my answer, I realized something had shifted. Not in him, but in me. The words felt rehearsed, detached, like I was quoting someone else. When the call ended, I sat very still. There was no relief this time, no satisfaction, just a hollow space where confidence used to live. Over the next weeks, more calls came. Not confrontations, clarifications, the kind that circle a truth without touching it. I reassured, I contextualized, I reminded. At night, I began hearing my own voice when the room was quiet. Not accusing, just present. The same tone I'd used on them, now turned inward. Eventually, the calls stopped. Silence replaced them. That was worse. I imagined them sitting at kitchen tables, paperwork spread out, trying to trace the moment everything tilted. I imagined my voice there with them, still calm, still convincing. I told myself I had never forced anyone, that every signature had been voluntary. That intent mattered. The arguments sounded weaker each time I repeated them. When the investigation began, I cooperated fully. I answered questions. I provided records. I listened to my own calls played back in rooms that smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. No one accused me of shouting or lying outright or threatening. They described my voice instead. Measured. I understood then what I had actually been selling. Not opportunity, not freedom. And relief, once taken, is difficult to return. Now when I speak, I hear the weight behind every word. I hear how easily calm can become leverage. How comfort can move faster than reason. I no longer trust my own tone. I don't know if I ever should have. Sometimes I wonder if they still hear me too, echoing faintly when they try to sleep, reminding them that the decision felt right at the time. That's the part I can't undo. Not the money, the quiet,